God has this thing that he passes out called grace.
It started during a quiet evening in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. The sun had just dipped behind the western hills, painting the horizon with streaks of amber and crimson. The air was calm, the kind of calm that comes before a conversation that shakes the world. Steve Harvey, the world-famous television host known for his humor, wisdom, and deep Christian faith, had arrived in Burkina Faso for a documentary series on faith and leadership in Africa. He was excited, genuinely so, to meet President Ibrahim Taore, the young leader who had become the face of African independence, courage, and moral conviction. When they finally met, there was a respectful silence. Steve extended his hand, smiling broadly. "Brother," he said warmly, "I've been wanting to meet you for a long time. You're doing something the world hasn't seen in decades, leading with faith, not fear." Traore smiled humbly. "Welcome to Africa, my brother. Here, we still believe that leadership is not about power, but about truth. And sometimes, truth is heavier than the throne." The two men sat under the wide roof of the presidential compound, surrounded by candles and the soft hum of the night. Cameras were off. This was not an interview. This was two men, from different worlds, talking about God, truth, and humanity. Steve leaned forward first. "You know, President, I've always said my success didn't come from luck. It came from faith, from trusting God even when I couldn't see the path. But lately, I've been asking myself, what does faith really mean in a world so divided by religion?" Traore looked at him for a long moment before responding, his eyes steady but kind. "That's a powerful question, Steve. The problem is that the world no longer understands faith. People have turned religion into identity, and identity into division. Faith is supposed to unite us with God, not separate us from one another." Steve nodded slowly. "I agree. But people always ask me, which faith is right? Christianity, Islam, or something else? Everyone claims they have the truth." The young president smiled slightly, as if he had heard this question 1,000 times. "Steve, truth does not belong to any religion. Religion is like the language through which humanity tries to express its understanding of God. But God himself, he has no language, no race, no tribe. If you take water and pour it into 3 different cups, is it still not the same water?" Steve's eyes widened. "So you're saying all religions are the same?" "No," Traore replied calmly. "I'm saying they are all trying to reach the same mountaintop, but they take different paths. The tragedy is that each path mocks the other, instead of realizing they are climbing toward the same light." There was silence. The wind whispered through the palm trees. Steve sat back, deeply moved. "Man, that's deep. I've read scriptures my whole life, preached about salvation, about Jesus, about faith, but I never thought of it that way." Traore continued, his voice firm yet filled with compassion. "Jesus came to remind humanity of its divine purpose, not to create another group of followers to fight others. He came to bring peace and love, not competition. But today, we have turned his message into a weapon. We build churches taller than mountains but ignore the hungry child crying in their shadow." Steve swallowed hard. His eyes glistened. "You're right. Even in America, Christianity has become more about image than about inner truth. I've seen pastors driving cars that could feed a whole village. Sometimes, I feel we're losing the heart of it." Traore leaned forward, his tone quiet but powerful. "Faith without compassion is hypocrisy. A man who praises God but ignores injustice is not faithful, he's fearful. He fears losing his comfort more than losing his soul." Those words hit Steve like thunder. He looked away for a moment, gazing into the distance. "You know," he said softly, "I've always believed God gives people different assignments. Some preach, some serve, some lead. But maybe some of us are just supposed to remind the world what love actually means." Traore nodded. "Exactly. The greatest form of worship is not the prayer you say, but the love you give. That's why I tell my people, stop waiting for heaven to appear after death. Heaven begins when you live with truth, humility, and love here on earth." Steve chuckled, shaking his head. "You're blowing my mind, man. That's not what most preachers say." The president smiled faintly. That's because most preachers fear losing followers more than they fear losing truth. But truth doesn't need followers, it needs witnesses. At that moment, Steve Harvey's entire perspective began to shift. This was not just a political leader speaking, it was a man whose understanding of spirituality cut across every religious boundary. He asked softly, "Do you ever wonder if religion itself has failed humanity?" Taore paused before answering. Religion has not failed, men have. Religion is a tool, but when men use it for ego, it becomes a weapon. Islam, Christianity, Judaism, all came from a desire to understand God. But when people started claiming they owned God, they lost him. Steve's voice was quiet. "So how do we fix it?" "By returning to essence," Taore said. "By teaching children not to hate, not to divide, but to question and to seek truth with open hearts. By reminding the world that God is not a Christian or a Muslim, he is beyond our walls. When we learn that, religion becomes what it was meant to be, a bridge, not a battlefield." A hush fell over the courtyard. Somewhere in the distance, the muezzin's call to prayer echoed through the night, blending with the faint sound of gospel music playing from a nearby radio. It was as if the two worlds, Christianity and Islam, were whispering to each other, just as Traore had said. Steve looked at him with renewed respect. "You're a different kind of leader, man. The world needs to hear this." Traore smiled humbly. "The world will only hear it when it is ready to listen. Truth is not a noise, it's a whisper that grows in silence." As they stood to leave, Steve placed a hand on his shoulder. "Brother, tonight you didn't just speak politics, you spoke my soul." And in that stillness, something profound had shifted. Steve Harvey, a man who had spoken on countless stages, was speechless for the first time in years. He realized that maybe, just maybe, faith was not about finding the right religion. It was about finding God inside yourself. The following morning, the golden sunlight poured into the presidential courtyard. Birds sang over the quiet hum of activity, soldiers preparing for a new day, aides whispering about schedules, and journalists waiting outside for a brief statement. But inside, Steve Harvey sat once again with President Ibrahim Taore, this time over a simple breakfast of local bread, honey, and tea. Cameras were still off. No reporters. Just two men still trying to understand the mystery they had opened the night before. Steve leaned back, sipping his tea thoughtfully. "You know, I barely slept last night," he said, chuckling. "Everything you said, it just kept running through my mind. Especially what you said about heaven starting here on earth. I've been preaching for years about eternal life, about what comes after death. But you made me think, what if heaven isn't a place we go to, but something we carry inside?" Traore nodded slowly. "That's the truth most people fear, Steve. Because it means responsibility. If heaven begins inside, then so does hell. And that means we can't keep blaming others, not even the devil. It means we are accountable for the world we create." Steve leaned forward, deeply intrigued. "That's powerful, man. But what about salvation? You know, in Christianity we believe Jesus is the only way to the Father. That's what most of us were raised to believe." Traore smiled gently, his expression one of deep thought. "I know that verse well. But let me ask you, what do you think Jesus meant when he said, 'I am the way, the truth, and the life'?" Steve replied carefully, "That he is the path to eternal life. That through him we are saved." Traore nodded. "Yes, but think deeper. When he said, 'I am the way,' he didn't mean the man named Jesus was the path. He meant the Spirit, the truth he carried, is the way. The compassion, the love, the sacrifice. The path of purity, forgiveness, and unity with God. If people follow his example, they are walking the way. But instead, humanity worships the messenger and forgets the message." Steve sat in silence. His mind was spinning. "You mean to tell me that salvation isn't about religion, it's about reflection?" "Exactly," Traore said, his tone steady. "When Jesus said, 'Follow me,' he didn't say, 'Join my religion.' He said, 'Follow my path.' But after his death, people began building walls around his words. They said, 'You must belong to our church to be saved.' But Jesus never built a church, he built a movement of hearts." The weight of those words hung heavy in the air. Steve looked down for a moment, his fingers lightly tapping the table. You know, I've seen people in churches fight over the smallest things: doctrine, money, fame. I've seen pastors claim that their denomination is the only one that leads to heaven. But when I see you talk, it's not about religion at all. It's about truth. Taore leaned back, his hands clasped together. Because truth is not owned by any religion. You can find truth in a mosque, a church, a temple, or even in the silence of a forest. God speaks through everything that breathes. But only a humble heart can hear him. Steve nodded slowly. Man, that right there is what people don't understand. You're not denying Christ, you're elevating his real message. Taore smiled faintly. Jesus is not just a Christian figure. He is a universal symbol of divine love. Even the Quran honors him as Isa, the Messiah, born of a miracle, full of light. But religion divides where truth unites. The moment you believe your group owns God, you lose him. Steve took a deep breath. That's gonna shake people up. Especially in America, where religion and identity are so tied together. The president chuckled softly. Then let it shake them. The world needs shaking. People defend their religion more than they defend truth. You can insult their humanity and they will stay silent, but question their dogma and they will want to destroy you. Steve laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was true. Man, you're right. I've seen people get angrier over a church debate than over injustice. I used to be like that too, until I started traveling. When I went to Africa, I saw Muslims praying with Christians. I saw people sharing food during Ramadan and Christmas alike. That's when I realized, faith isn't the problem. Ego is. Taore nodded deeply. Exactly. And ego is the root of spiritual blindness. Every prophet came to destroy ego. That's why they were hated. Because the ego loves to be worshipped, even in the name of God. The two men sat quietly for a while. Then Steve spoke again, more softly. You know, I've always wondered, if Jesus were alive today, walking through the streets of America or Africa, what would he say to us? Taore smiled knowingly. He would probably say the same words he said 2,000 years ago, "Love one another as I have loved you." And then he'd ask, "Why did you forget?" Steve felt chills run down his spine. That's powerful, brother. Because you're right, we forgot. We turned his message into a brand. We turned forgiveness into a sermon, not an action. We preach what we don't practice. The president's expression grew solemn. That is why Africa still stands with faith. Because here, despite poverty, we still feel God in the soil, in the rain, in the laughter of our children. Faith is not about buildings. It's about breathing. It's about knowing that every sunrise is a reminder that you're part of something greater. Steve looked around the courtyard, the trees, the children playing in the distance, the workers moving quietly in reverence of the president. There was peace here. A real peace, not born of money or fame, but of awareness. You know, he said thoughtfully, America has churches in every corner, but people are still depressed. Still angry. Still lost. Maybe what they need isn't more religion. Maybe it's more connection. Taore nodded. Yes. The West built cathedrals but lost the essence. Africa built community, and that is why God still walks here. Because where there is unity, there is presence. For a moment, both men were silent again, letting the weight of those words settle. Then Steve asked, "Do you think one day religion will disappear?" Taore smiled faintly. No. Religion will not disappear. It will evolve. When humanity matures, it will no longer fight over forms. It will recognize that every religion is a mirror. Some mirrors are cracked, some are clear, but all reflect a part of the divine face. When people stop worshiping the mirror and start looking through it, then we will see God. Steve exhaled slowly. "Brother, you're preaching now," he said with a laugh. "That right there is a sermon." Taore chuckled too. "No, Steve. That's just truth. The truth that was spoken before any scripture was written." Then, with a thoughtful tone, Taore added, "Do you know what religion originally meant?" Steve frowned slightly. "No, what?" The word religion comes from the Latin religare, which means to bind back. It was meant to reconnect man with God. But today, it binds man to institutions. What was meant to free our spirits now controls our minds. Steve leaned back, utterly stunned. Man, that's deep. That's real deep. Taore continued quietly. Religion should be like a boat. It helps you cross the river. But once you reach the other side, you don't carry the boat on your head. You leave it behind and walk freely with God. That's what Jesus, Muhammad, and all prophets try to teach. But humanity keeps carrying the boat, arguing about whose boat is better, and no one crosses. Steve was silent for a long time. Then he said softly, "You know, you're not just a president, Ibrahim. You're a teacher. And I feel like this conversation is going to change how I see everything." The young leader smiled humbly. "I'm still a student, my brother. The more I learn about God, the less I know. Because the closer you get to truth, the more infinite it becomes." The sun rose higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the courtyard. Steve Harvey sat back, completely absorbed. This wasn't just a discussion about religion anymore. It was a revelation about the soul. And deep down, he knew this was the kind of truth the world needed to hear. Later that evening, the palace was quiet again. The conversations from earlier still echoed faintly in Steve Harvey's heart, phrases that refused to fade. Heaven begins inside you. Truth is not owned by any religion. We worship the messenger and forget the message. He couldn't shake them off. As he sat outside on the balcony, watching the orange sunset settle over Ouagadougou, he saw President Ibrahim Taore approaching with his usual calm stride. The young leader was holding 2 cups of tea. "Still thinking about our talk?" Taore asked with a knowing smile. Steve laughed. "Man, you got my brain running laps. I've been asking myself things I never dared to question before. I mean, I've preached to millions, hosted shows, talked about faith, but you made me feel it, not just speak it." Taore handed him a cup of tea and sat beside him. The orange sky deepened into purple. "You see, Steve," Taore said softly, "when you start to feel truth, not just understand it, that's when faith becomes alive. God never asked us to memorize him. He asked us to remember him." Steve looked at him curiously. "What do you mean by that, remember him?" The president smiled. "Every soul already knows God. We are born with that light. But the world teaches us to forget. That's why prophets come, to remind us. Religion is meant to help us remember who we truly are." Steve nodded slowly. "You know, that makes sense. When I was a kid, I didn't know anything about doctrines or theology, but I felt God. I'd look up at the stars, and it felt like something was watching me, not to punish me, but to guide me. That was before I even stepped inside a church." Taore smiled. "That's the innocence that connects us to truth. The world complicates it with rules and titles. But to a child, God is simple: love, protection, wonder. That's why Jesus said, 'Unless you become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven.'" Steve's eyes softened. "So heaven isn't up there somewhere, it's a state of being?" "Yes," Taore replied. "It's when your soul is free from hate, greed, and pride. Heaven isn't a reward, it's a realization. The moment your heart beats in rhythm with God's will, you're already in heaven." Steve chuckled, shaking his head. "Man, you're turning theology upside down. You're gonna get a few preachers mad with that one." Taore laughed lightly. "Then let them be mad. The truth doesn't fear anger. Remember, Jesus made the priests angry too. They wanted to control faith. He wanted to free it." The 2 men shared a moment of silence, watching the last light of day fade. Then Steve spoke again, his voice lower and more emotional. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Of course," Taore said. "Do you ever feel doubt? I mean, you talk with such confidence, but you're human. Do you ever ask God, 'Why me?' Or 'Why now?'" Taore's eyes turned toward the horizon. "Every day," he admitted. "Every morning when I wake up, I wonder why God gave me this role, this burden. But then I remember, faith is not the absence of doubt. It's the courage to walk through doubt with trust. He took a sip of his tea before continuing. Even Jesus cried out, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" in his hardest moment. That wasn't weakness, that was truth. God allows doubt so we can learn to trust deeper. Without darkness, light means nothing. Steve nodded thoughtfully. That's real. I've had moments like that too. Times when I thought I lost everything, and then somehow, God used that pain to show me something bigger. Maybe doubt really is part of faith. Taore smiled. It is. Doubt refines faith the way fire refines gold. There was silence again. The city lights began to twinkle in the distance. The hum of crickets filled the air. Then Steve said, "You know, earlier you said something that stuck with me, about how people worship religion instead of truth. I keep thinking about all the wars, hate, and division done in the name of God. Why do people fight over who owns the truth when truth itself never fights?" The president looked up at the stars. Because people mistake belief for truth. Belief is what your mind holds. Truth is what your soul knows. Religion is supposed to be a ladder to reach the sky, but men start worshiping the ladder instead of climbing it. That's why humanity remains divided. Steve exhaled slowly. So what's the solution? How do we fix that? By returning to the root, Taore said. By realizing that love is not a doctrine, it's a duty. When you truly love, you stop seeing difference. Whether a man prays to God, Allah, or simply meditates in silence, if he carries kindness in his heart, he's already walking the path of light. Steve smiled, deeply moved. You know, I think if more world leaders talked like this, maybe peace wouldn't sound so impossible. Taore laughed softly. Peace begins when truth replaces fear. But most leaders use fear to control their people. I believe in using truth to free them. Steve nodded slowly, impressed. And that's why people respect you, man. You lead with conviction, but also with compassion. That's rare. The president shook his head humbly. I'm just a servant, Steve. A servant of my people and of truth. If God gave me this platform, it's only to remind others that leadership without faith is blindness, and faith without love is hypocrisy. Steve placed his cup down and looked deeply at him. You know, hearing you talk like this, it's crazy. I came here thinking I'd interview a political leader, but I'm leaving feeling like I just sat with a prophet. Taore chuckled gently. No, my friend. I'm not a prophet, just a man learning to listen. The voice of God is not loud. It's like the wind. You only hear it when you're still. Steve smiled. You're right. We talk too much sometimes. We don't listen enough. Taore nodded. That's why I meditate every morning before the world wakes up. Because before you speak to the world, you must let the world's creator speak to you. Steve looked up at the night sky, his voice soft. You know, I used to think being close to God meant knowing all the answers. But now I realize, it's more about asking the right questions. That's wisdom, Taore said with a smile. The wise don't claim to know, they keep seeking. The more you seek, the more you see that God is not far away. He's in every breath, every kindness, every moment you choose truth over ego. Steve turned to him. And that's what Jesus was trying to show us all along, wasn't he? Taore nodded. Yes. He wasn't trying to start a religion. He was trying to start an awakening. He came to show mankind its own divine potential. To tell us that heaven is not something to wait for, it's something to become. Steve felt tears building in his eyes. That's beautiful, man. I feel like I just had church out here tonight. The president smiled warmly. Maybe that's what real church is, Steve. Not four walls, not a title, not a building. Just two souls sharing truth. The moonlight shimmered on the marble floor as the night breeze swept gently around them. Steve exhaled, then said softly, You know, when I get back home, I think I'll start talking differently about faith. Less preaching, more reaching. Taore grinned. That's how the world will change, one honest heart at a time. Steve smiled back. I like that. They sat in silence for a while longer, both lost in their thoughts. Then, as if remembering something, Steve turned to him again. One last question, my brother. You've talked about heaven, truth, and love. But what do you think happens when we die? Traore looked up at the stars again. When we die, I think we wake up. Death is not an end, it's a return. Just as a drop returns to the ocean, the soul returns to the source. The body is the garment we wear to learn. When it's torn or old, we take it off, but we are still alive beyond it. Steve's eyes softened. So, death isn't something to fear? Traore shook his head. Not if you've truly lived. Only those who never loved fear death, because they never touched eternity while alive. Steve's voice cracked slightly. That's the most comforting thing I've ever heard. The young leader placed a hand on his shoulder. Brother, remember, eternity isn't in the future. It's in the present moment. Every act of love is eternal. Every truth you live today becomes your heaven tomorrow. Tears glimmered in Steve's eyes. Thank you, Ibrahim. You've changed something in me. You didn't just answer my questions. You answered my soul. Traore smiled. Then I've done my duty as a brother. They rose, shook hands, and shared one last look of quiet understanding. Two men from different worlds, yet bound by one truth. God is bigger than religion, and love is greater than fear. As Steve Harvey walked back to his car under the starlit African sky, he whispered softly to himself. Maybe heaven was never up there. Maybe it was right here, all along.